Akhenaten was an ancient Egyptian pharaoh, the 10th ruler of the 18th dynasty. As a pharaoh, Akhenaten is noted for abandoning the traditional ancient Egyptian religion of polytheism and introducing Atenism, or worship centered around Aten. He was the husband of Nefertiti. Akhenaten took Egypt's throne as Amenhotep IV, but changed his name to Akhenaten in his regnal year 5. Around the same time he changed his name, Akhenaten decreed that a new capital city be built, Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten, better known today as Amarna. By regnal year 8, Akhetaten reached a state where it could be occupied by the royal family. According to current Egyptian chronology, Hatshepsut's final year was in 1458 BC, while Akhenaten's final year was in 1334 BC, meaning that their final years were separated by 124 years. However, in my previous research titled Sotic Rise recorded in the Elephantine Stele was on May 23, 1124 BC during Thutmose III's first solo year and Hatshepsut's final year. I dated Hatshepsut's final year at 1124 BC instead, implying that Akhenaten's final year was in 1000 BC or 124 years after in my revised Egyptian chronology. A second verification of dating Akhenaten's final year to 1000 BC was made in my previous research titled Redating Mursili II's solar eclipse to August 2, 979 BC means Hittite chronology is 334 years early. Now, the solar eclipse mentioned in a text dating to the reign of Mursili II is of great importance for the absolute chronology of the Hittite Empire within the chronology of the ancient Near East. The text records that in the 10th year of Mursili's reign, the sun gave a sign just as the king was about to launch a campaign against the kingdom of Hayasa Azi in northeastern Anatolia. The text specifically said, "When I marched to the land of Azi, the sun god gave a sign." Since I dated this solar eclipse in 979 BC during the latter part of Mursili's 10th year, this means his first regnal year according to my revised Hittite chronology was in 989 BC. Furthermore, the start of Mursili's reign is used by Egyptologists for dating Tutankhamun's death since, according to the Hittite annals, Mursili II's reign started shortly after the death of the Egyptian queen Takhamunsu's husband. This Egyptian queen is believed by Egyptologists to be Ankhesenamun, the wife of Tutankhamun. Thus, in my revised Hittite and Egyptian chronology, Tutankhamun's death occurred in 989 BC. According to current Egyptian chronology, the number of years between Akhenaten's final year dated 1334 BC and Tutankhamun's final year dated 1323 BC was 11 years. Because I dated Tutankhamun's death in 989 BC instead, this means Akhenaten's final regnal year, which occurred 11 years earlier, was in 1000 BC. Also, since Akhenaten ruled for 17 years, this means that Akhenaten ruled Egypt from 1017 BC up to 1000 BC. Two horizon solar eclipses occurred during Akhenaten's 5th and 8th year. If you still recall, he changed his name to Akhenaten in his regnal year 5, during which time he decreed that a new capital city be built, namely Akhetaten, meaning horizon of the Aten. By regnal year 8, Akhetaten reached a state where it could be occupied by the royal family. The solar eclipse, which occurred during Akhenaten's year 5 was on May 9, 1012 BC at 1612:47 UTC, and it had an eclipse obscuration of 58% as it crossed the western horizon at sunset. The solar eclipse, which occurred during Akhenaten's year 8, was on September 1, 1009 BC at 3:24:38 UTC, and it had an eclipse obscuration of 24.87% as it crossed the eastern horizon at sunrise. You can verify this using Stellarium and by setting the algorithm of delta T to JPL Horizons and the location at Thebes with coordinates 25 degrees, 43 minutes, 14 seconds north, 32 degrees, 36 minutes, 37 seconds east. I used the location of Thebes as the observational site because this was the capital of the 18th dynasty, during which Akhenaten reigned and before he moved to Akhetaten in his 8th year. After observing the solar eclipse on the western horizon in 1012 BC, followed by the solar eclipse on the eastern horizon in 1009 BC, both the western and eastern boundaries of Aten's capital, Akhetaten, were clearly demarcated by the solar deity Aten. This is why an inscription on a boundary stele declares that the site was chosen by the sun god himself in the place which the Aten enclosed on the eastern bank for his own self. According to Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews, Book 8, Chapter 6, Paragraph 5, the Queen of Sheba was the Queen of Egypt and Ethiopia, and that Cambyses II, after conquering the capital of Ethiopia, changed the name of its capital from Seba or Sheba to Meroe. In my opinion, the Queen of Sheba, the capital of Ethiopia, who was also Queen of Egypt, was Nefertiti, who married the king of Sheba soon after Akhenaten's death in 1000 BC. We know from 1 Kings chapter 10 verse 9 that the Queen of Sheba praised the God of Israel for placing Solomon on the throne of Israel. Thus, it can be said that the Queen of Sheba was a worshipper of the God of Israel and therefore monotheistic. And in the entire history of ancient Egypt, there was only one queen of Egypt who practiced monotheism and at the same time a contemporary of Solomon, and that was Nefertiti. I believe Nefertiti visited Solomon as the new queen of Sheba right after the death of Akhenaten in 1000 BC to console her eldest daughter and eldest child with Akhenaten, namely Meritaten, who I concluded was the Pharaoh's daughter and wife of Solomon, mentioned in 1 Kings chapter 3 verse 1. Thus, Akhenaten was Solomon's father-in-law. During the final year of Akhenaten's reign, Smenkhare, who was husband to Meritaten, became co-ruler of Akhenaten. Smenkhare's origins are unknown to Egyptologists. However, in my opinion, he was one and the same as Solomon, who became Akhenaten's son-in-law. Let me now show you why I believe Akhenaten and Nefertiti were contemporaries of Solomon. According to Josephus' Antiquities of the Jews, Book 8, Chapter 7, Paragraph 8, Solomon died when he was already an old man, having reigned 80 years and lived 94. Current ancient Israeli chronology dates the final year of Solomon in 931 BC. If Josephus was correct in saying that he ruled for 80 years, this means that Solomon's first regnal year was in 1011 BC. And since in my revision of Egyptian chronology, Akhenaten's reign lasted from 1017 BC up to 1000 BC, this means Akhenaten Nefertiti, and Solomon were contemporaries during the late 11th century BC. In 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1, we are told that Solomon started building the temple in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. Since I dated Solomon's first regnal year in 1011 BC, this means the temple construction started in 1007 BC. 1 Kings chapter 6 verses 37 to 38 tells us that the temple was finished in Solomon's 11th year, which in my revised chronology was in 1000 BC. 1000 BC was when Akhenaten also died and when Nefertiti, as the queen of Sheba, visited Solomon and her daughter Meritaten. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 also tells us that Solomon started the temple construction in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt. 480 years before the start of the temple construction in 1007 BC is 1487 BC, which is when I believe the Exodus from Egypt took place. In contrast to Josephus' statement regarding the 80 years reign of Solomon, 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 41 to 43 tells us that the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Was there a contradiction here? Not necessarily. That is, if we take the words over all Israel into consideration. In my research, the first 40 years of Solomon was shared with his older half-brother Adonijah, who said the following to Bathsheba, Solomon's mother, in 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 15. As you know, he said, the kingdom was mine. All Israel looked to me as their king. But things change, and the kingdom has gone to my brother, for it has come to him from the Lord. During Solomon's first 40 years as king, which he shared with Adonijah, Solomon was busy building his palace and the temple, which took Solomon 20 years to finish. See 1 Kings chapter 9 verse 10. After these first 20 years, and in the next 20 years of co-rulership, Adonijah may have confined Solomon's duties to temple administration, while Adonijah effectively ruled all of Israel as their king. In other words, Solomon was king only by title and not by function during his first 40 years. It was only during Solomon's last 40 years of his 80 years as king that Solomon became sole ruler of all of Israel. Note also that shortly before David died, David had his son Solomon crowned king publicly. See 1 Kings chapter 1 verses 32 to 48. Thus, even if Adonijah seized control of the throne shortly after David's death, Adonijah still cannot take away the title of king from Solomon. Note also that in the case of David, 2 Samuel chapter 5 verses 4 to 5 differentiated between his reign in Hebron over Judah for 7 years from his reign in Jerusalem for 33 years over all of Israel. Since I believe Solomon's first 40 years were confined in Jerusalem only as the temple administrator, it can rightly be said that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel only during the last 40 years of his 80 years reign. Now, if the Exodus was in 1487 BC, then who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus? In one of my previous videos titled, Menopres was Merneferi I, not Menpetire Ramesses I, and his Sotic rise happened on May 23, 1385 BC, I dated the Sotic rise of a new Sotic cycle that started what Theon of Alexandria called the era of Menopres in 1385 BC. I also identified Menopheres with Merneptah I, the longest reigning pharaoh of the 13th dynasty, whose reign was dated by Kim Ryholt between 1701 to 1677 BC. Since I dated the start of Merneptah I in 1385 BC, while I dated the Exodus in 1487 BC, this means the pharaoh of the Exodus was the one whose reign ended 102 years before the start of Merneptah I. Using current Egyptian chronology, which dates the start of Merneptah I in 1701 BC, then the pharaoh of the Exodus should be the one whose reign ended in 1803 BC. According to current Egyptian chronology, 1803 BC was the year before the final year of Sobekneferu, queen of Pharaoh Amenemhat IV, who succeeded him after his death in 1806 BC. In my previous video titled The Pharaoh and Queen of the Exodus were Amenemhat IV and Sobekneferu of the 12th dynasty Egypt, I identified the pharaoh of the Exodus as Amenemhat IV. It is my conclusion, therefore, that current Egyptian chronology either dated Sobekneferu's reign 3 years too early, or it dated Merneptah I's reign 3 years too late. And by correcting this small error in Egyptian chronology, the pharaoh of the Exodus, whose reign ended in 1487 BC and 102 years before the start of Merneptah I's reign in 1385 BC, was Amenemhat IV.